Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. We are going to give everybody a couple minutes to get settled in and we will get started. We have a jam-packed agenda today, but welcome and thank you for being here. Hello, welcome. Please let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat. Say hello. Dr. Jefferson has a kitten saying hello to us as well already. The best kind of visitor, I think. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Because we have such a packed agenda, I am going to quickly go through some housekeeping items. First and foremost, thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, where we will be speaking about a new tool to help animal welfare organizations build better budgets and garner support from both municipalities and their communities. For housekeeping today, it's our usual spiel. Please feel free to ask any questions and do so by entering them in the Q&A function down below. If you're wanting to chat with your fellow attendees, please do so. Just ensure that the toggle is switched to everyone so that everybody is able to see it. As always, we know that you'll keep the chat kind and respectful, so we appreciate you doing so. And lastly, at the end of today's webinar, there will be a brief poll, so please stick around to fill that out. Let us know how we did and how we can do better in the next ones. And lastly, as always, there will be a recording sent out for today's webinar, and they always live on the Haas website as well if you'd like to revisit them at another time. So we are eager to get started, and I will pass the mic over to our lovely presenters, Dr. Ellen Jefferson, the CEO of Austin Pets Alive, and Maggie Lynch, who is the Senior Director of Research and Data at Austin Pets Alive and Haas as well. So thank you both for being here, and feel free to take it away, Dr. J.
Okay, let me pull up my slides, and thank you for introducing us. We'll get right into the business of this. I think hopefully everybody on the call has heard about the Human Animal Support Services project that we have been working on for the last few years. And one of our big project pieces was this budget calculator. It became really evident as organizations were working together during COVID, just how much information is missing when we're looking at how shelters are funded and the work that we're trying to do. And so hopefully this tool that we've worked on as part of the Haas project will be something that can be used by everybody. And so we'll walk through a little bit about that, as well as the results you can expect from it, and also what we're looking for in the future as a phase 2, if we find the funding to keep working on this project in particular. We believe it's really important, but obviously we don't print money. So we're trying to figure out how to keep it moving forward one way or another. So the very first thing I want to start with is the goals of the project, but I want Maggie to explain that as she's been leading the actual budget collection and creation of the budget calculator on the website.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. So we have a number of goals here that I'm not just going to read all the slides. You can read through these, but I'll go through them. And I want to emphasize that this is the first iteration of the calculator, and it's not exactly where we wanted it to be, but we got it pretty far. There were a couple years of data research that went into this, and we released it when we did last January, in part because we know the industry is in crisis. And we know that part of that crisis is underfunding. And so we wanted shelters to be able to advocate for more appropriate budgets sooner than later. We wanted to get a conversation started within the industry, and we wanted our shelter directors to begin having the tools to talk to city leaders persuasively. And also, the calculator is going to go through a second phase where it's going to be refined. And part of what we're doing with this first iteration is collecting data on the back end. Also want to emphasize that we will never, ever release anybody's specific data that's traceable to them. We are only looking for aggregate findings. We're looking for things like regional differences in the calculations. And also, we know that policymakers are always need data, and this is lacking in our field for the advocates that are trying to get us better funded. And last, this is a great tool to get communities on your side. We'll turn it back to you, Dr. Jefferson.
Okay. Yeah, I would just add to that last point is that much of the turmoil that's happening in communities around animal services is a direct reflection of the budgeting and the funding that is going in to support the activities that the community expects. And so we believe that there is an opportunity for animal shelters to harness the energy that the community brings forward while they're advocating for better care and better everything, being able to then point to, okay, this is how much it's going to cost. Let's start working towards this. We think that we can change the tenor of the conversation by talking about these, by talking about our work differently. And the budget calculator is a great way to do that. Okay, sorry, my screen does not want to move forward. Oh, there it is. Okay. And I apologize. I need to try to move this thing out of the way because I can't see the top of my screen. So the Haas, I believe that the top of this is saying that the Haas project is was really created for those of you that don't know, the Haas project was really created about trying to bring people in. And many ways that we do that is, I think the place where we've been focusing a lot of our time is by connecting to people services, trying to figure out how animal services can connect more effectively to the human services that exist in the community. How do we support people that are at risk of losing their pets? And we know that by harnessing that, we can see a decrease on the burden that shelters have by simply allowing people to keep their pets, and that means that we support them differently, giving them more support so that they don't have to relinquish or lose their pet after being lost and found, lose them permanently to the shelter. The other pieces of this that are around the human side of this Haas name is increasing the quality of care, not only for the pets, but also understanding, allowing people to better understand what their work should be culminating into, and how we start turning our passion into data-driven and evidence-driven work, much like human hospitals do. We believe that a budget calculator, tangentially, but the Haas project overall will improve the workplace environment for all the people that are working in the shelter. We know that there's a great deal of moral stress. We know that suicide rates are very high. We know that most, especially the government-funded shelters, are not the best environments for people. And there's a lot we can do, obviously, to combat that. But when you look at how more advanced industries have solved that over time, we're really far behind. And Haas is an attempt to improve not only the human-animal bond outside the shelter, but also help the humans and the animals inside the shelter. And then lastly, I think a lot of times people forget that it's not just the humans that are direct guardians or caretakers for the animals, but it's also people just generally who care about pets. And there's every community is made up of people that care about what is happening in their community, and they may not necessarily be one of those pet owners or people that we're normally interacting with. And so we'll talk a little bit about that here. But as we're thinking about underfunding, if you start looking at the problem of underfunding in animal shelters, and you start looking at the huge symptoms that we have in our industry with overburdened staff, because people are simply trying to do it all without the resources, and we see a high level of burnout. We see a high percent of turnover. One thing that we saw front and center as the Haas project is after COVID, when shelters started to fill back up, everybody lost their ability to even think about change and changing the model. And so, and that is also a symptom of just not having any room for thinking differently. We see animal suffering and death in shelters that is wouldn't be necessary if we had the right services, resources, compassion fatigue, outrage in the community. All of these things can be tied back to underfunding. And I think it's really important that we shift the conversation away from this person's an evil individual running the shelter, or this shelter is doing really bad things. I think we need to really start pinpointing where a lot of this is coming from, and it is at a higher level than most of us are operating in the animal welfare industry. And it is something that we actually can influence, and we can bring more funding in. But right now, most communities don't know how to advocate for more appropriate funding. They don't even know how to define more appropriate funding. So that's part of what we're trying to get at with this. It's not going to be a solution that fixes everything, but this is really why we embarked on this, and why we believe it's so important for all of us to be well versed in budgeting and advocating for the resources that we need. So Maggie, I'll pass it back to you.
So we base the budget on what we know communities expect, and we've done a lot of research and data collection at Haas and found some of these figures. And one of the most heartening ones is that when we ran a survey of 9 communities across the US that was designed to be representative of the population, 91% of the people believe that government shelters, and this means the government funded shelters, either through a contract with a nonprofit or directly through people employed by a city or county to run their shelter, they all believe that shelters need more funds. So we have the public behind us. Not only that, they don't believe in the majority that money should come from philanthropy. They think it should come from taxpayer funds, either shifting taxpayer funds or increasing funds slightly. Most people do believe and want our shelters to provide better care than many of us can because of lack of resources. Things like dog walks at least once a day. In the majority, people wanted pets to be in foster homes and not in the shelter. They know that the shelter is a rough place for an animal to be. They believe that families should be supported in getting resources when they're having trouble keeping their pets. They believe in the majority that all animals should be released live unless they're dangerous or terminally ill. And this includes animals that are a little bit challenging and need a little extra help, some rehabilitation, either medically or behaviorally. They expect that dogs with behavioral challenges are being helped in the shelters and getting training daily. And 90% of them expect that there is appropriate veterinary care. And by appropriate, we mean that animals in the shelter where homelessness is not a diagnosis, is what we say it at our shelter, but that we will be able to give pets that are homeless the same kind of care that a person of average means can give. So these are pretty high expectations for where we are operating now, but this is what communities want, and we have data to back this up. Over to you, Ellen.
Okay, so looking at some of the data information we have, this is a little bit of an older chart, but I think it's really important to look at when we look at the when we look at that last slide and some of the statistics that we got out of a community value survey, we are understanding better that where the community is coming from when they're outraged that something's happening at the shelter or something's not happening at the shelter. There is we have that public sentiment that is telling us in pretty explicit terms what they want to see happening. And then we have the flip side of how animal shelters are being supported in government systems. And what we work to do is gather budgets. We now have more budgets than this, but this slide hasn't, I don't have a current slide to help show this better, but hopefully we can work on that. When you start to see how animal shelters across the country, their budgeting over time has not dramatically gone up. There's been an increase, but it's not growing at the same rate of other city services. And if you pick sanitation or you pick parks or you pick any other type of service that is important to a community, they have a much steeper incline over years, and animal services stays relatively flat, even though some of these animal shelters got significant increases to their budgets. So when we start looking at that, it starts to explain maybe why we're feeling the way we are with some of the those symptoms that we discussed a few slides earlier. And then you also put that into context and you look at 311 calls, and not everybody has a 311 service, but in Austin, that is the city's non-emergency number. And so everything that's not a 911 emergency comes in through 311, and then it gets dispatched to the various departments. And right now, when this graph was created, only 20% of the calls coming into the city of Austin were about animals. Now 30% of the calls coming in are about animals. And what we found looking at many of the communities that are pilot shelters in Haas is that many of them have statistics that are alarmingly similar. So you see this mismatch between attention that's being paid to budgeting increases and attention from the community that is being placed on the services that people want. And so we have an opportunity. I think this slide really speaks to the opportunity that we have to advocate better for ourselves and align better to what people are advocating for in the community, align with those people and those sentiments, provide the blueprint to be able to do more. You can bet that the departments that have a much steeper incline are much more sophisticated in advocating for the needs that they have and the increases to their expenses.
So we have,
yeah.
Yeah, we have shown that the budgets that we have are not really appropriate for what is being expected of our industry. But what is an appropriate budget? And that is the question that drove the data behind the budget calculator. And I want to emphasize again, we're not trying to budget for current operations if you're not able to meet these expectations. The budget calculator is designed around, and the formulas have assumptions built into them, that you are going to be operating an ideal operation, one that meets the expectations for humane care and for very high levels of life saving. We can go on.
Okay.
And so there was a working group, a government budget working group that worked on the data behind the calculator for almost 2 years. And it was a really intensive effort. And one of the first things they did was decide that if we're not budgeting appropriately within animal welfare, then we need to look outside of animal welfare to see how other people budget. One of the main places where the group looked was at the for-profit world, because we live in a capitalist society where businesses only survive if they are, on one hand, lean enough to be competitive with other similar services, and yet are spending adequately to satisfy expectations for services. So they can't spend too much and they can't spend too little. And if they're going to survive, they have to know what that middle ground is. And so business planners incorporate a lot of data, which we're going to see in a couple slides further on, to calculate what their expenses should be. In the animal sheltering world, we have often heard people, when they're asking for a new budget request, simply asking for the cost of a new position. It's a very programmatic, very simple, not data-driven way of asking for a new budget appropriation. But in businesses, they can parse out and tell you in great detail why they are asking for, or why they are pitching an expense at a certain rate. So we looked at the for-profit world and a few nonprofit entities as well that are far ahead of us on how they budget. And some of those make perfect sense, and you would expect them. We got data from a boarding facility chain, which very generously shared their data on things like how long it should take to clean a kennel and how much staff you should have. Also the same for veterinary hospitals. One of the big veterinary chains told us exactly how they calculate when they're opening a new location, and they have to know what kind of expenses they're going to see. But some of them were a little bit less intuitive, but they were very similar functions. So for example, here, animal field services bear a lot of similarity to appliance repair services, where you have people calling in and then dispatching someone to go take care of a problem. They travel an average distance, they spend an average amount of time. solving that problem, and then travel back. And that's very similar to how field services run. And so we use the data from appliance repair services. And the group looked through a lot of examples before they settled on the one that made the most sense. Call centers, we think, should be a really essential, central part of any shelter, especially when you're community-based, the way the HOS model promotes. And so we looked at hotlines. Call centers in particular have gotten very, very scientific about how they calculate. They can calculate very precisely what it should cost to run a call center. And so we looked at other call centers, but settled on suicide hotlines because they seem to have the same kind of load and call time and staffing costs that we would expect to be true in animal welfare. You can go on.
And did you want to talk about veterinary services?
I mentioned that we use the expenses from that chain that told us how they calculated if they're opening a new location, what it would cost. If you want to say more about it, since you were part of that group.
No, that's good. Thanks. I missed that, I guess.
And we're going to turn this back over to Dr. Jefferson. And this is the back end, is a tab on the back end of the calculator. There is a spreadsheet that has many, 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 many tabs. But Dr. Jefferson can explain how this works.
Yeah, and so we don't have a way to make this a do-it-yourself piece of the current calculator, but it gives a glimpse into what we're trying to populate based on the data that's coming in that you're putting in or that you would be putting in. And I know there was a question in the Q&A about whether this is adjusting for inflation. And yes and no. I think we have the opportunity to look at forecasting budgets out beyond a year. Right now, the way that it is sort of taking into account changes in budgets is looking at a minimum wage. So there's a first tab to this whole giant thing that where when you put in your minimum wage in the do-it-yourself calculator, it will then populate all the salaries moving forward. And so some of the notes, like this one that says $15 to $20 an hour, those are just notes for ourselves, but everything is being based on what the minimum wage is. So if the community has, or a shelter has a very high minimum wage compared to another shelter, then all of their costs are going to be higher than that other shelter because it's going to populate all the salaries on up from there. But what this page is trying to show is the call center. It's the simplest of all of the ones we have. And so looking at, as you put into the calculator, your calls per year, then we'll start pulling in the calls per month, calls per day, and then trying to calculate out, making sure people have breaks. They're not going to be answering calls 100% of the time that they're on the clock. And this is, again, why it's important for us to look at other industries because they've figured this all out. Call center industry is very methodical about how much time people are actually on the phone and how many minutes per call on average. And they actually have metrics where their teams are striving for those times. I don't know, sometimes metrics can be a double-edged sword, but I think it's important to know a little bit about what we're striving for because it's kind of the Wild West in our industry. But then if we have a better idea of the expectations per team member to get through the workload that is prescribed to us, especially government shelters, then you can start to predict your costs better and you can expect a certain amount of workload per person. You know when you need to hire another person, you know how much your department's going to cost. And just as a side note, and I know we'll talk about this at the very end, but if we're really looking at connecting the people to the work that we're doing in the shelter, we need to stop basing budgets on intake and basing it. I believe that budgets need to be based on call volume because the call volume is the community crying out for help. And that's really where the unmet demand is if we're only evaluating our costs based on intake. So that's a conversation for another day, but I think this calculator is super important as we're looking at trying to change our base model of funding in the years to come as well. But you can see that every department would have a supervisor salary cost most of them have supplies cost. This doesn't have a lot of that just because it's baked into the administrative costs of running a call center with the call equipment and the software and all of that. So hopefully that is explaining a little bit about it. You're welcome to put questions in the chat if you'd like to, and we can try to answer them as we're going if they're relevant to the slides that we're looking at in that moment. We don't want to make this that we're just talking at you the whole time, although it's kind of hard with a budget calculator.
And one thing about this slide is that cost per call line, it averaged out to 261, which is great because we read that in call centers, the average cost per call should be between $2 and $5. So this is lean operations, but it's within the range of being able to pick up that phone and answer promptly.
Uh-huh. And I think you mentioned this in the last one when you were talking about the suicide prevention line, but it's shocking that their average minutes per call is somewhere around 5 minutes. And they're dealing with extremely heavy emotional topics in those calls. And so if we're looking towards a better service model where we're giving people more resources on the phone and hand-holding them through more of the back end of finding whatever they need to keep their pet, then or rehome the pet themselves or whatever, it may not be a time function that we're fighting against when we feel like we don't have enough time to really offer that kind of support. I think it may be more of having our resources all lined up and ready to be deployed and having those people on speed dial to work with another department or another service within the city or another nonprofit, being able to connect the dots a little bit more effectively than we're used to because we're so siloed away from a lot of the other resources that exist for helping people. Okay, and then this one is around the dog boarding costs and it's complicated, and this isn't front facing, so you don't see all these different tabs, but it's important to note that if you think about sheltering in general, it's a very complicated task. People are typically doing so many more things than just taking care of the pets like they would in a boarding facility. But when we look at boarding facility staff costs and how much time they're allocating to everything, it is more than we're spending, that's for sure. But it makes it a little bit more manageable to digest. And we're hoping with the next iteration that we can start looking at some of these statistics because let's see, I think all of the yellow cells are things that eventually what we'd like is for the person that's using the calculator to be able to input. And so by being able to say, I'd like for every dog in my care to get out of the kennel at least 30 minutes a day, then you can start determining what your personnel needs are. How many people does that take a day? What if I decrease the number of kennels that I'm operating out of and send more animals to foster? Then that is a change in the number of people you need. And in all shelters, staff is going to be your number one cost center as opposed to equipment or supplies. And so when we start understanding better what our inputs are and how we can basically maneuver them around or lever them up and down, then that allows us to be in control of the destiny that we're trying to create for the animals and be able to present a conversation with evidence to the policymakers that are expecting budgets to match community demand, which we know they don't. So understanding you have a community, I think a lot of shelters are under a lot of scrutiny for not getting dogs out of their kennels, for the shelters not providing enough exercise. And so by being able to bucket it out into cost, it'll be a lot easier to have that conversation. And, the worst thing, and we'll talk about this at the end, but the worst thing would be for this to be used for a tool to not take care of the animals or to increase a non-live release rate. Really, ultimately, we want this to be a tool that improves everybody's lives, animals and people. And there's only one way to get there, and that's knowing what it takes to get there. So that's our purpose with this. But eventually you'd be able to see, okay, length of stay, number of animals in foster. If we change something in our cleaning protocol so that we're spending less time cleaning a day and it's more efficient. We buy different hose equipment or create a different pattern of flow, then what does that do to our staffing needs? All of that's connected. It doesn't feel connected in the world that we live in, but it's very connected. And you'll notice that this is really thinking about non-behavior dogs, because when we look at boarding, we're looking at the average dog in dog boarding, and then behavior dogs are in a different tab and a different calculation for like a board and train facility where people are bringing their pets and expecting them to get the treatment. And you'll remember with the community survey that Maggie walked through that most community members expect dogs to be getting some sort of training in a shelter environment every day. So their expectations are a lot higher than even our expectations as animal welfare advocates. But I think that that's an important thing to note, that if the community is expecting one thing and it's not adequately funded, then there's a conversation that needs to be had. You can do it with less money. And certainly we see that with the amount of overtime and burnout. But there's other methods to get there. One is to utilize more volunteers. As you're growing your budget, volunteers are a personnel that doesn't have the cost associated with it. And being able to look at your total staff needs for the day and then being able to bucket out, okay, I need to really focus on building up this one piece of our volunteer team. Then that's going to help you put all this into perspective. And there's nobody that has the budget that's required to do this as if we were a boarding facility, because most government shelters and nonprofit shelters have a large number of kennels, and they don't have the budgets to support that, but we can get there. Okay.
So I hope our webinar team will drop the address for the calculator in the chat, and I'm sure some of you have already seen it, but if you haven't, this is how you find it on our homepage under Resource Center. There's a list of our many digital tools, and the top one is the calculator. The URL is there as well. We kind of didn't introduce this at the first because we didn't want you to get distracted by filling in the calculator while we talked, but we can move on and look at what you see when you open up the calculator.
Yeah, and I wanted to answer a question that came in about the call center cost. And the question was, how do we calculate the cost of replying to email or social media inquiries, similar or higher cost than phone calls, especially given all the back and forth? And that is not actually calculated in there right now. It's simply a call center. I think probably one way to resolve that, well, I think that's a piece that could certainly be built out if that is a main source of conversation for sharing of resources, or those people can be directed to a phone number to call into the call center. But I know what you mean by that question, but it's not baked in there. Social media back and forth, email back and forth is not baked into the call center, but it's something that does need to be addressed. Okay, going back to the actual calculator.
So this is, if you haven't seen it before, is what the top of the calculator looks like. We couldn't fit the whole thing on this page. There are only 19 input fields, and those were determined by the tests that we ran this through. We ran it past several shelters and determined what is the data that most people know to put in. And these were the input fields that we settled on, and they're enough to give a really high level budget and to break it down by department. We do ask for your shelter name and your zip code, the name, because we want to see if you use the calculator more than once, maybe there's a new thing in your budget, and we want to see what kind of changes those are. The zip code is, again, because we're trying to determine if there are regional differences in costs, and that zip code helps us. So put it in. We will never reveal it to anybody outside of our system. The most important field is the shelter type, because government employee staff shelters have very different costs from ones that contract with nonprofits. And so if you put the wrong shelter type in, you're going to get the wrong answer, because that is like a basic part of the calculation, and it cascades down into every piece of the calculator. If you're a nonprofit, this wasn't really designed for nonprofits. We're really trying to get to advocate for bigger taxpayer funding, but you can use it as a nonprofit. It will just calculate as if you are a nonprofit with a government contract. We ask for your email address. We'll never use that unless we're just emailing you back with a question about your calculator. It will not be anything unrelated. We're not going to put you on a list somewhere and pepper you with email. We ask about the population of your jurisdiction because that is an indicator of adoption capacity, and the calculator builds in operational differences. So for example, if you don't have enough households in your community for the number of animals that you need to adopt out, then the calculator kicks over to placement through transport. It would recommend in the background that you're not going to be able to adopt out everything in your community. That will be a rarity. Most communities do have the capacity. We also have data on that. But if you are one of those outliers, the calculator takes that into account. Next. Here's another piece of it. One tip, usability thing that we couldn't overcome in our web development. The only thing you can put in the input fields is a numeral or a decimal point. If you put a % sign, a $sign, a comma, it won't work properly. Also, these are fields that help you tailor the calculator to your shelter. So this is not just any shelter. When you put in these fields, you are tailoring the calculator to your circumstances. So if you have a very high stray dog intake, the calculator kicks over to calculating return to home costs at a greater rate than another shelter that might have lower stray intake. If you only intake cats, then only put in information for cats. If you only intake dogs, it's the same. If you do both, then you fill in both fields. Next slide. Now there is a limitation, and there are more limitations listed on the landing page for the calculator, which is the first place you go when you type in that URL for the calculator. It's only for dogs and cats. If you're one of those shelters that also takes care of wildlife and livestock, you would have to calculate those pieces of your shelter separately. We may get to the day when we get everything in, but we got as far as we got with this one. One tip is if you do not operate your field services, or you do not do any of the things in the input fields, just put a 0 in there or don't fill it in, and the calculator will exclude that calculation from your total. Next slide. So when you finish your input field, you're going to hit that calculate my budget. It'll take you to a screen that asks you to go back, and when you go back, you'll see the output fields at the bottom of the screen. Your budget will be divided by department, so it gives you a little insight into where you're running really high costs and where you're running less. One thing to note is that there's quite a lot of money in here for community engagement, and that is because if you are going to have really great placement success and foster success, and you're going to draw a lot of volunteers, and you're going to get a lot of good attention from your community, you have to spend on marketing. And as we tested this calculator, we found that a lot of shelters, especially ones that are run by government employees, do not budget very much for marketing, but you're not bound to have great success with really high levels of life saving and really great placement unless you are spending on community engagement. And by that, we mean marketing, events, awareness. And another thing we're really interested in and the industry is really struggling with is cost per animal. So that is data that we're collecting on the back end to see how it is shaking out for various shelters. What is the cost per animal? Because we as an industry don't really have a good feel for what we should be spending per animal, and that is a very important indicator. Did you want to add anything, Dr. Jefferson?
Yeah, I was thinking back to that question about the social media and answering questions and going back and forth, and I think that cost should be built into that community engagement. So you don't have to forfeit social media, but don't count it in your call center. I think we and I'm just gonna say as animal people don't love the phone, but the phone is so much more efficient than email or social or any other platform where you're typing and then waiting for an answer and then typing an answer and waiting for an answer and typing an answer. But it is incredibly important for community engagement and helping people buy into your mission and what you're trying to achieve and your goals. And so it does need to be counted somewhere. And there's no business that budgets a low amount for marketing, because in the for-profit world, that's not a real thing, because everything else depends on customers walking in the door, and our customers come in all types, meaning that you have adopters, you have volunteers, you have fosters, you have donors, and if you're not engaging them, then they won't come, and that's how businesses fail. As government and even as nonprofits, we don't fail necessarily because people don't walk in the door and people don't engage with us and don't have a strong positive opinion of us, but we fail in other ways. And that's, I think, where we feel the pain of some of the circumstances that we're in constantly. And so this is calculated based on the businesses, not based on our world at all, but it is astronomical compared to what any shelter I know is spending on community engagement, marketing, outreach, awareness. So it's a good lesson learned too, but I think it's an important thing to keep in here because it is a driver. Okay. Moving on. I think there was one. Oh yeah, there's some questions that we'll get to at the end. Okay, I'm looking for some things to be put in the chat. I'm wondering which ones. So we've got a few dozen inputs from shelters. What do you think is ending up the most similar to current departments? In terms of how you saw that screen that Maggie had up of the departments being a certain dollar amount per department. Which department do you think is closest already currently with the current dollar amounts allocated to it, similar to the should be amount that is in the future? What do y'all think? I'll tell you there's two that are consistent. And I can go back to the slide that shows this. Yeah.
No one is daring to reply.
I see a couple of hands raised. I'm cool with some people shouting it out. I don't know if that's I'm not sure how it works on the webinar, but or you can put it in the chat.
They shut off audio, so you have to put it in the chat. If you got your hand
Okay.
up, be brave. Are you saying?
All right, I'm gonna let a couple come in before we answer. Okay, so a couple of y'all got it. It's the field services and veterinary services. And as we've thought through and we've been talking about it with the pilot organizations, those are the two areas that have professionals in them. There's professionals advocating for their real costs. How they're coming up with their real costs, we don't know, but they are the closest by far in terms of dollars being allocated than any of these others. So permanent outcomes is pitiful compared to that. Foster, pitiful. Everything else is pitiful compared to those two. So it really shows the power of the professional in the workplace and how they can be advocates for the things that they believe are necessary to do their work. And that's another piece of what the Haas Project has been thinking about, is how do we professionalize the whole industry so that everybody knows what's needed to do the job and can advocate effectively for their departments. That's obviously a longer term project, but it's something that's really important. It's an important piece of this puzzle as we think through how shelters are currently budgeted right now. It seems to be where the squeaky wheel is. And that obviously is not effective in the long run. Okay, wait, it's not moving. Maybe it will in a minute. Shoot. Well, all right. My screen is stuck. Apologies. Let me stop sharing and share again. Hopefully that's working now. Oh my gosh. All right, I guess I might need Katie to do this. My computer stopped working with me.
Let's try clicking.
Sorry about that. Or Nicole, will you be able to put it back up? Thank you so much. Okay, we can go to the next slide and then the next slide. Okay, so this slide, we just wanted to, oh, it shrunk down again. There we go. Sorry about that, technical difficulties. We wanted this slide to just show how off some of these budgets are from where we currently are to where we believe they need to be if we're trying to meet the community's definition of the care that they want and the service they want. And so we don't want you to be shocked by that. And many organizations are looking at this as like a 5-year plan. So understanding that we're way off and there's no way that that's just going to be granted to any entity overnight. But it is a way to start having a conversation with policymakers and with the community at large, and building that buy-in towards the future that they need. I think that when I talk to politicians over the years, where they see a lot of complaints is in animal services. It's probably the #1 source of complaints in many jurisdictions, but they don't know how to address it. And so often they don't do anything, or they throw something at it that may or may not help at all. And using something like this and bringing even the rudimentary look that this first iteration of the calculator can give is a start at having that conversation of this is why there's so much complaint. And I think that the obvious question that many policymakers may ask is, well, why don't we just euthanize the animals? Or why don't we get out of the business of doing this and give it to a nonprofit? But the cost is still the same. And if you have more non-live outcomes, or you or a government is asking a nonprofit to do all the work, there's still pain and complaints that are going to be coming from different sources. It just changes where that source is from. And so eventually the conversation has to land towards a better future where we are actually figuring out how to resource animal shelters appropriately. In the long run, that is probably a combination of nonprofit and government resources, but it should be an evidence-driven conversation rather than just everybody throws everything at it and hope for the best type of situation that many of us struggle in. So I just wanted to call that out. Okay, we'll go to the next slide.
So at this point, with this first iteration of the calculator, it's not going to be a budgeting tool for you to use and just use in detail, but it plays certain really important roles. It tells you that what is that total of what it would cost for you to operate as your community expects. And that's a really powerful tool to use. It tells you how basically that is going to break down department by department so that you can see where you're spending a lot of money or should be spending a lot of money, and maybe where you don't need to spend as much. It also gives you a starting point for that multi-year effort to raise your budget, which Dr. Jefferson just addressed. No government is going to say, yeah, I'm going to give you $6 million more when your budget has been $8 million. But this is why we wanted to get the calculator out sooner than later. You have to start that conversation, and you have to expect that it's going to take years before you get there, but it is well worth the effort.
Okay, and then this is really just talking about where we're moving, where we want to keep going with this. And we believe that there's more work to be done about calculating the community-based needs. much like the conversation about the call center numbers and understanding what the community is demanding. We don't do much with this right now, but we know that there's a certain percentage of people that are calling the animal shelter, calling for services from the animal shelter. And that should be influencing the direct interaction that we're having with animals, especially those coming into the care of the shelter. What we're missing is the community need overall. And how do we base our community facing programs on the actual community needs, not just what we believe they need? And that's where that community values, that's where that community values survey is so important. Understanding what the needs are and the quantity of those needs is the next iteration of the calculation. So we should be able to calculate for access to care, for meeting needs like pet food, the pet food needs in the community, being able to budget for training needs. We know behavior is a big driver of intake. Even housing, what is the cost that a shelter should be thinking about to improve the situation around housing and pets that are not accepted into certain types of housing. So that's for phase 2. We also want to make more of that piece that we showed you behind the scenes. We want to make more of that a plug and play. Right now, it's impossible for us to actually make it so that you can see that on your end. But ideally, you should be able to say, I want 50% volunteers, or I want whatever it is, and then be able to quickly calculate how that looks in terms of dollars and staffing and animals and cage numbers and fosters, all of that, how it all plays together. The other things that we haven't done a good job of in this one is really trying to take into account where donations do come in. And so if you're getting all of your pet food donated from a company, a corporation, then how do you account for that and decrease your overall budget costs by that and call it out? Because that's also an important driver of future resources, is being able to say, we've got this % of our total budget covered by pet food. And so 2 things out of that. One is it allows you to plan, if that donation dries up, what are you going to do? But also it allows the proper recognition for those donors. And it doesn't allow you to lose sight of the total budget that's required to do your operations. The admin costs and marketing costs and community engagement costs are kind of lumped in there. We'd like to build those out into a more detailed format so that you can see better what those are and what the expected ROI is of those, a return on investment. And then ideally, there would be a way for you to be able to create that chart that I did at the beginning, where you're looking at various jurisdictions, you're looking at maybe even other departments within the same government jurisdiction, and being able to see the whole picture. One of the things that this calculator can't show us yet is, let's say you're in a community with an extremely high poverty rate, probably the total dollars that government has to spend for animal services is lower in relation to another community that's very affluent and has very low poverty levels. And so how do we start building in that information so we can quickly identify communities that maybe need more support from nonprofits outside of their jurisdiction to help them serve their community and serve the animals and the people in their shelter a little bit better and a little bit differently. But that's all part of a future phase of this project that we don't have at this exact moment. Next slide. I think this is the last slide. Yep, that's the last slide. So we're just extremely grateful for being able to at least get to this point, where we are extremely grateful to everybody that participated in the government budget working group and helped to pilot this model, the calculator, and then PetSmart Charities and Maddie's Fund for funding the first iteration of it. And we're open for questions. I know we didn't leave a lot of time for Q&A, but you're welcome to email us at this email address and we'll get back to you. Also, if you put your question in the chat and we don't have time to answer it, we will circulate answers to those questions with the recording of the presentation in the next week or so. So do we want to run through a couple of questions, Nicole, in the last 4 minutes? You can, yeah, there you go. Um, yes, there's so many tools that we need to be sharing, like job descriptions and let's see, any other questions?
At this time, Dr. Jefferson, we have only one remaining question, which is there going to be part of the budget calculator for programs such as foster programs to include items such as staff costs, calls, training, marketing? A lot of those line items that you briefly mentioned have yet to be included. Do you want to speak on that?
Can you say the first part? It kind of cut off a little bit.
Of course. Is there part of the budget calculator for programs such as foster?
Yes, foster is included in there. And we are putting it at a pretty high percentage based on the community feedback. Again, this is a should be calculator, not necessarily a reality calculator at this moment. But we know that most people that have filled out the community values survey in the jurisdictions it was deployed in, which I think was around 10, we had an extremely high rate of expectation that animals are taken care of outside the shelter in foster homes. And so that percentage, I believe it's over 50% that it's already baked into the calculator. What we'd like to do is be able to make that a plug and play where you could say, okay, what if I want to decrease my overall kennels by 50% to decrease the people power that's required to go into that, which is huge. And then divert some of, obviously, if you increase foster, you still have people power that needs to go into caring and supporting those people that are taking care of pets. So we want to be able to make that a little bit more of a linear, something that you can see really quickly. If I make this one change over here, I can make this change over here. And the foster costs are built out based on the human foster model, which I know is flawed in a lot of ways, but looking at a case management approach as opposed to what we see in many shelters where you have one person that is responsible for 2,000 animals in foster, ridiculous proportions like that, but really trying to make it a little bit more based on what we know is a reasonable number of people and animals to support through one staff person. So anyway, that is part of the calculator, yes.
Thank you. And then our final question before we close out for the evening is, are there current models of publicly funded shelters that are partially funded but not operated by local community nonprofits and that work cooperatively with their public shelter?
I think there's a lot of examples of that. And I think that was the question, right? Are there models of that? And that may be the future. I don't know if it's reasonable that government funds the whole thing. Probably not. It seems like there has to be an intentional relationship between governments and nonprofits. And that might be through contracts, that might be through memorandum of understandings where you're taking on this amount of work and we're taking on this amount of work. But I don't think that we as an industry really understand how to break up that work so that there is that ability to say yes or no. I think many people feel like they're stuck holding the bag on both sides of the fence. And we need to be able to articulate better what exactly is the bag.
Well, thank you both so much for today's presentation. We really appreciate the time and the energy that you all put into our discussion, but especially, as you mentioned, the individuals that contributed to such an amazing project. And I'm hopeful as HOS continues that the budget calculator can continue with it. As we close out this evening, everybody, a brief poll will be popping up on your screen. Please let us know how we did, and we have dropped the URL to the HOS calculator in the chat, so please feel free to check that out for more information and send us any questions that you may have. We'll be happy to help you out. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Bye.